Some Monday car stuff going on again here. I thought I'd give you guys a little bit of a rundown here on some of the stuff I'm going to talk about today is methods I used when I was teaching, and so I'll be spinning around here and pointing at the screen and that kind of thing. And so I will start on this thing right now. I hope you're starting a good week. I know some of you guys, you know, I post these videos or I have them published at 6:30 on Monday morning, and some people don't have time to watch them until a little bit later, and that's okay. I really appreciate everybody that watches, and I appreciate all the new subscribers. So let me get on with this thing right here now. This right here was a station that I set up for a Skills USA competition in Birmingham, Alabama, back in 2003, I think it was, or 2002. And I was told, I was asked by a guy that was in charge of that if I would figure out some kind of a station I could use for competition. And so Ford had sent me a brand new, well, almost new, it was like a 98 Ford Ranger that didn't have about 35 miles on it, but it had been underwater in Allen Park, Michigan. It's a tan color when I've featured in some of these videos or in some of the pictures I've taken. But they also sent me 12 brand new rear axle assemblies and a brand new 3-liter engine, which I thought was interesting. Okay, so these 12 rear axle assemblies, I was just rear axle rich. I had so much rear axle stuff. And I took one of those brand new rear axle assemblies. They made me sign papers saying I would never put those under a vehicle. They never go on the road. I'd never even pull so much as a lug nut off of that Ranger. I got a trainer car from Hyundai one time in 2005. It was actually a 2006 model, but they had built it in 2005. And they made me sign a paper saying that it would never be driven on the road, and also that when the vehicle was done being used for a trainer, I would accompany it to the salvage yard and watch them crush the car. And so they basically didn't want somebody pulling parts off this car and putting them on the road. One way or another, I cut the ends off this axle, and I had the welding department put together a stand here, which I use some pipe clamps like you do on an exhaust system to buckle that down. And the only difference between this setup and a regular rear brake setup is the fact that there's no hub here, right? But it gave all of the students an opportunity to do that. And this is the one I was talking about, where I would do I would show them how to do it, and it didn't take me but about 2 or 3 minutes to pull the shoes off and put them back on, then I'd tell them to work on it. These people right here, there were 36 kids, high school kids, that were in this. I was supposed to eliminate my station, and a bunch of the other stations around there were supposed to eliminate the students that, you know, didn't do as well, and only the students that scored the best all the way around were going to compete in the competition, in the actual statewide competition. So this was a regional thing. There were 36 students. Only 3 or 4 of them had ever even worked on drum brakes before, and just about all the rest of them were complaining because they didn't understand why they were having to fool with drum brakes, because they said disc brakes were the wave of the future and nobody even needed drum brakes anymore. Nobody even did them anymore. And so what's the point, right? And so I told them that they needed to suck it up and do this anyway. Well, I used this same trainer stand to train a girl that I was taking to the 2006 Skills USA competition 2 or 3 years after this. And she had never even taken brakes or steering and suspension, but she was really smart. She was homeschooled. And I told her, I took her over there to the other shop, and I says, you take these brakes off and put them back on until you're sick of it, and then you do it some more. I don't know what they're going to have you doing for brakes up there at the competition, but this is what I want you to practice on just in case, you know. And lo and behold, when we got up there, they had a 2006 Ranger with exactly these same brakes on it, jacked up, and she was only one of 40 students that even got the thing put back together in the allotted time. So anyway, this was a tremendous amount of fun. It was one of the more productive training aids that I ever built, you know, particularly in doing brakes and stuff like that. And it got to the point where the students, the ones of them that you know, that I'd show how to do this, would do it over and over just because they enjoy doing it, and that's how you get really good at something. Now this was another exam this is an exam I set up basically for the students to. There was two different boards that I had here. This board right here basically had two connection points for positive and negative. It had a switch, and you were supposed to wire it up. I had a little schematic on here. So you're supposed to build this circuit by hooking power here, ground here, and then all you basically did was went to the switch, and from the switch to this post, from that one to the resistor, from the other side of the resistor through a light bulb that was over here, and whenever you turned it on, you basically had a circuit that was flowing, and there was some voltage drop here in that form of that resistor. That was two 10 ohm resistors that I put together in parallel to make it 5 ohms. And so basically what I had them doing, and I'll show you the sheet in a minute, all the instructions, keep that in mind. This was the little box I had hooked to a power supply up there. I called it the juice box, and it was just got 12 volts right here. And this one I had wired up for them. Now you see these 4 switches on here? Those 4 switches are the kind of switches that you can't tell if they're off or on by the position that they're in. There was a motor, there was a relay, there was a switch here, and there was power and ground connected to this. All right, and so what the deal was, when I had the board in front of them, one of those switches would mesh. I also had 2 relays that looked exactly alike, and one of them had been doctored so it wouldn't work. And when I would have them sit down in front of me, I'd say, okay, to start with, I want you to, trace how power gets to the motor and all this. And then I would say, you're going to push this button, and this circuit is not going to work. And I need you to, what I wanted them to do was pull the relay out and get a little cheap LED test light that I had here and troubleshoot that relay socket to determine why this thing wasn't working. I said, if you get to the point, now you remember a relay socket like this, it's just a plain old ISO relay. They're supposed to have, and the normally closed terminal wasn't being used. That's the one in the middle. I says, what you need to do is you're supposed to have, I had told them going into this so that they would supposedly know how to do this, 2 powers and 2 grounds. Whenever you push that button to operate that relay, and you're checking it with that test light, you need 2 powers and 2 grounds in that socket. One of the grounds is going to be coming back through the motor. All right, and so I says, now then, this enabled them to show me that they could read a schematic. The other one was designed so they would use every aspect of their little multimeter that they had. It would show me they knew how to set the meter up, how they knew how to take the readings, and what various different things meant from the measurements they were taking on the board. I created these boards from scratch myself because this was just a couple of simple little things. It was easy to put them in a briefcase along with everything you needed to make this thing work except your power supply, which was a big cumbersome thing and all that. You could use a jumper box, but anyway. So that's a board, that's a board. And each one of these, they had a time limit on them to make it happen. Now I also used this in a skills competition. I initially built these for a skills competition that was similar to the other when it was a regional thing. And so I would have these things set up, I would slide their sheet over there of what they were supposed to do. And what totally amazed me was how many people, these were all high school students, that were automotive students, and they would come through, and some of them, the first thing they would try to do when they were wiring up this little board here with the switch circuit and the resistor and the light bulb, is they would try to take power and ground and hook it to each side of the switch. Hook power to one side of the switch and ground to the other side. And at that particular point, I had to be a judge and not an instructor. And I was sitting there with my arms folded, and when I would see one of them pick up the power and the ground and try to hook it to either side of the switch, I'd say stop. And they'd stop, they'd freeze. I'd say put your wires down. They put their wires down, and I would say lean back. And the clock was running, and I'd say you're done. What do you mean I'm done? I'd say you don't know enough you don't know how to wire up a circuit, or you wouldn't have been trying to hook power and ground one to each side of a switch. As soon as you turn on the switch, you smoke the jumper wires. And so I'd have to stop them. They'd get mad at me, some of them would. Now there were some people in there that were pretty sharp and knew how to wire this thing up. But there were, most of them didn't have a clue. Anyway. Alright. This was the part 1. This was the one that had this little circuit. There was a lamp, there was a switch, there was a resistor, and then I had this little Ohm's law thing here. Measure the resistance of the resistor. That was the ohms. Measure the resistance of the bulb. That was ohms, right? But there's a reason why I had them doing that. Using the jumper wires, resistors, and the schematic below is real easy. Put power here, ground here. You can see how easy that was. And they said, this is so elementary, why are you even wasting their time? You'd be surprised how many of them had trouble with this, because I've always said that electrical is something you have to have the aptitude for, or you're really going to struggle with it. Now, anybody, it seems to me like, ought to be able to understand it, but, you know, I'm not that good at algebra, but my dad could do it with his eyes closed, even though he didn't get past the 10th grade in school. Some people are just good at some things better than others. Now, this right here was the circuit. All right, build it, turn it on, you're going to have the light burning, you'll have current flowing through that resistor, right, with that switch closed. All right, perform a voltage drop measurement between the power source and the bulb with the switch closed and the lamp illuminated. Okay, the power source would be here, and the bulb would be here. So you're basically performing a voltage drop test here, right, between here and here. You can understand the benefit of learning how to do this because this teaches you about voltage drop. Okay, measure voltage available at the lamp. You're going to measure that right here while the lamp is illuminated. Set your meter to read amps and measure how many amps the bulb is consuming. This told me they knew how to use the amp function on the meter to measure amps. Okay, what they have to do there is basically, if you open the switch and you hook your amp meter up where the switch was, that's where you get that. There's other ways you could do it, but that would be the simplest way to do it. All right, and it says using your source voltage, which is, you know, what you'll get from here to here, and the measured amperage, use Ohm's law formula to determine and write the calculated resistance of the circuit while the bulb is illuminated. And so basically, what I was going to do is get them to use all of the numbers they had gathered here to determine what the resistance was with this in here. Now, the resistance is going to differ because the lamp will have more resistance when it's burning than it will when you just measure the amperage. You might have 1.5 amps, not amps, resistance. You might have 1.5 ohms of resistance whenever it's not burning, but you'll have like 5 or 6 ohms when it is burning. So if it's not illuminated and the filament's not hot, because it's going to be a positive coefficient resistance thing. Anyway, that was the first board. The second board, I would put this little schematic up here, and I even had the little relay up here. Normally open coil, and common. That's a relay pin out of this relay right here. And then this would be part 2. All right, this is where the battery was. You got power and ground right here. This was hooked up underneath. They didn't have to wire this up. It was already wired up. I didn't have my bug buttons pictured on the schematic. But basically what happens is when you operate that switch, that's going to close the relay, and the power is going to be pulled to go to that motor. They would push that switch. This wouldn't work. And what they were supposed to do was go right here. Basically, if you're at your coil and you're normally open, you know, the normally open is basically the one that's going to go to here. So if I'm measuring right here and this switch is not energized, I should find a ground here because the motor's grounded, right? Should find a ground here, and with the switch pressed, I should find a ground here. So I should have ground here with the switch pressed and the relay removed. Okay, but I ought to have power here, even if the relay's not. And so once you figured out that you have power here and ground here with the switch closed, you know that it's a bad relay. My deal with them was, if you tell me you need a relay and we plug another relay in and the relay wasn't what the problem is, then you're done with this exercise. That always scared the daylights out of them. Of course, on the car, you know, a lot of times you'll swap the relays around, but I wanted them to be able to troubleshoot this. And in some of these competitions, I've heard of these kids just swapping a relay right quick because that's what they expected people to do to set up the bugs. And so whenever the people at the judges table say, how do you know it was a relay? They say, we just did. You know, this kind of stuff. They couldn't explain anything. All right. These problematic split terminals here, like Ford had on a lot of their sensors and on some of their PCMs and stuff like that, used to just irritate the stuffings out of me because it didn't take a whole lot for them things to get where they were spread a little too far apart and they wouldn't make continuity. In other words, you'd have a bad connection there. And I mentioned one time before, they had a small version of this and they had a bigger version of it. Well, there was another small version that looked just like this and would fit in the same connector, but it had a sort of a brass sleeve up here and it wasn't split. And so there was a transition between those. One time we got some bunch of Ford Rangers that was supposed to have the ones with the little brass sleeve up here that wasn't split. And whoever, somebody at the factory had put this kind of terminal in there and made all kinds of problems. We have Rangers and stuff black smoking because of the, bad connection and all. But the long and the short of it is, I would take sometimes and pull the little wedge out and tweak all of these things and pinch them a little bit so that it'd make a better connection. Of course, pin fit's really important. One GM instructor said that if you unplug and plug a lot of these GM connectors 4 times, you compromise the connector integrity so that they don't make a connection anymore. But I dealt with these kind of things for many years, and I never really liked this split terminal nonsense. They wanted it to be able to spread out a little bit when it plugged in, so they could technically have a snug connection. Now this right here, see the signs of heat when you've got a hot circuit? On this particular one, this GM thing, we found signs of heat right here, but we didn't really find anything on any of these terminals over here. This had been warm, but it hadn't really burned anything up and it hadn't compromised any connections. But that is a sort of a red flag when I see discolored connectors like that. Usually it's more noticeable on the white ones than it is the black ones, unless they've, or the gray ones, unless they've started to melt. And these terminals are also numbered. They'll be numbered. They'll have alphabet one way and numbers the other way, and they'll tell you the color of the connector so you can track down which circuit it is. One of the things that I did when I was teaching over there was I had a fuse box, which I'm going to show you in a minute, that I had. It was one that came off of a 07 Buick Rendezvous, and I laid it over there, and I would say, I'd say, I want you to look up an 07 Buick Rendezvous, and I want you to look up the fuse panel details, and I want you to find out, and I'd pull one of the relays, and I'd say, I want you to find the terminal on the bottom of this. I don't want them to look at the terminal in here that was basically connected to a particular relay leg on the inside. And of course I had the cover that had told you whatever relay did. And so this thing was just laying on the bench. This was a bench job, and they were able to measure continuity. I said, show it to me, and they'd get continuity and measure from that terminal to that one. It was a really handy little thing I did. But it was one like this. It wasn't the same one, because this one right here burned out. See how that burned out? And how they're numbered right here, F, 12, 11, so on and so forth. And that one there was scorched. Somebody had fixed this before. See the heat shrink in that terminal right there? All right, the reason this vehicle came to us, it was intermittently dead. It wouldn't start sometimes. And the lady, she was an instructor on the other campus at the college, and she said that it was her daughter's vehicle. And they had taken it to the shop, and they had put a fuel pump in it, and then when it still didn't start, they just threw their hands up and gave up on it. Well, we caught it in the act, which is key in a situation like this. If it's intermittent, it's a booger bear. And what we did was, we went right here, unplugged the fuel pump relay, and my old trick I'm always talking about, I went from hot side of the fuse panel, hot side of the battery, and I went right here. Now if you look at the schematic, that doesn't go through a module of any kind, it goes directly to the pump. So in there, in that relay socket, and I didn't have a picture of that side of it, you unplug that relay, you go to the one, you find the one that you know is the output terminal, and you're going to find a ground going to that fuel pump. We did not find a ground here. And the problem was right here, because this was burned and it was scorched and it had been hot, and that was burned and it was scorched and it had been hot. And I basically got another fuse panel from a salvage yard, and you had to make sure it's the right one. You can't just pick any fuse panel. It's got to be the one for the same year model with the same equipment on it and all that, and there's a way to do that. And we got that, and it came, believe it or not, with those big connectors plugged into it. Now, if you try to buy a wire harness or something like that from a salvage yard, they're not going to unplug the terminals and bring you the wire harness with all the terminals. They're going to snip, 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 snip. I always hated the way they did that, because they don't want to have to fool with unplugging the terminals. They'll just cut the things and let you solder everything back together. That's why I never really liked buying wire harnesses from salvage yards. But some salvage yards may unplug them, I don't know. But the salvage yards I've dealt with have a tendency just to snip, 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 and you get a wire harness without any connectors on it, and I hate that. All right, so because the connectors are part of your problem sometimes. Anyway, what we wound up doing was we replaced this connector, and we also replaced that. We actually replaced that connector. This shell right here was a little scorching. I can't remember. We may have pin by pin replaced that entire connector block. I can't remember how we did that, but one way or another we fixed it so that it wouldn't go again. Now, one thing I like to do is I like to put some silicone dielectric grease and or some Stabilant 22 on that. You can look up Stabilant 22 and it helps the connection be, the dielectric grease keeps oxygen from getting in there and oxidating the terminal even if it tries to warm up. Pretty handy for that. Stabilant 22 is a good thing too. Learned about that from Craig Van Battenberg at the hybrid course, but anyway, so new fuse box, knew that, took care of the whole thing. Alright, this was a wiring competition that I wanted to show you. It won't take long to watch. What they were supposed to do was wire it up so that whenever you operated the switch back and forth, this would burn or the motor would spin. And they had to know how to wire it up. That was a little power thing that I pulled in from the, power source I had. All right, see now you might want to notice, see it's running right there. All right, that thing's spinning. That power window motor's spinning. When he gets it all wired up, he's going to turn that switch on, and then that stops and that comes on. See, that's the way it's supposed to work. Okay, now I got another guy that's going to do the same job. They all know how to do that. I had them do this until they were sick of it. And they were really good at that. And this guy right here made one critical error. You notice I always tell them to make sure that these things are down here so you don't make contact with other jumper wires. Look at this. He let the smoke out of the jumper wire and it smoked up the whole classroom. And everybody was like, and there was cussing going on and all that kind of stuff. All right, now this is when I was working at the dealer at the Ford place. See my SBDS machine back there. And the reason this video was being taken, there was a lady from the local station that wanted to know if I could talk to her about oxides of nitrogen. And so she said nobody in town, and it's like 60, 80,000 people living in town over there, none of the mechanics at any place wanted to talk to her about oxides of nitrogen. I said, well, I can talk to you about oxides of nitrogen. And so she had these videos of me, and there was another news report about I was training this guy right here and all. But I just told her, I talked for about 5 minutes about oxides of nitrogen with her cameraman there and her holding her microphone in my mouth and all that. And then when I watched the news report, she used about 8 seconds of what I said, or maybe 5. That's just the way that works. But anyway, I just figured you might like to see that. You can tell that this spark plug here is wore out. This is not anything particularly interesting because anybody that's done a lot of work on cars has seen wore out spark plugs, whoop-de-doo, who cares and all that. But this is an unusual thread on that spark plug. I don't remember what we pulled it out of, but it's not an average everyday spark plug. It's a different type. All right, this is a half moon wrench. Some of y'all might have this and some might not, but this was made for old Ford starters. This guy that I worked with back in '77, and he actually runs a school bus shop over here now, and he's a really, really, really good mechanic, one of the best ones I've ever known. Real crisp the way he does everything. He said, he was complaining about, he said sometimes it'll be 4:30 on a Friday afternoon and somebody will come in on a Ford with a 390 and it needing a starter drive, and they just drove it from Columbus, Georgia. Get out of there trying to fight with that 30 minutes before quitting time and get it knocked out. And you had to have one of these wrenches right here to get on it, because that's the only thing you can get on those starter bolts with on those old Fords. That's what that was designed for. You can look that up, and they call that, a wrench like that, a half moon wrench, believe it or not. Now this old man that worked in the shop was referring to that as a half moon wrench, and my friend that I'm talking about, he thought that was something I made up. But when I looked it up, that's actually called a half moon wrench. And out there is 5/8 and 9/16. I always thought 5/8 and 9/16 was a kind of an outlaw. It ought to be half and 9/16 if they're going to have, two sides on it. But I guess they felt like sometimes you'd have a 5/8 you need to get on. This vise was busted by a student. You know how whenever you're putting a U-joint in there and one of the little needles falls down so that you can't press the little cap all the way in because it just won't go? And he was trying to press that thing far enough in so he could get the circ limp on it. And he just kept turning the handle on that vise and turning the handle on that vise. He felt like the harder he squeezed it, the more likely he'd be able to get it in there. Finally, the vise gave way. And that's an old vise, too. I mean, it's not no cheap second-rate vise, but it was cast iron. You know what cast iron will do. And that vise was, it was done for after that. We put a different vise on that bench. All right. This right here is sometimes what we run into. I don't know. I used to get irritated sometimes when I would legitimately try to take an oxygen sensor out, and I don't know if somebody had pulled it out or when they put it in at the factory, they didn't put anti-seize compound on the threads or something like that. It would take the threads out with it, and then a student would get a new oxygen sensor, or maybe even the one they pulled out of there, and they try to screw it back in there. See, this was one that when we went to screw it out, we had to grab it, and it brought the threads out with it. And so you got to run your 18 millimeter thread tap in there to take care of that. It's one of them kind. And this was not all that common, but when you run into it and you figure you're going to have a real quick and easy oxygen sensor swap, it's really a pain to deal with something like this, especially if it's in a hard place to get to. All right. This right here is carbon tracking in the plug wire. See that carbon track right there? It was made right here. Okay, now the problem I ran into that back in 1991, this guy brought a skipping 91 Explorer, which had Qualpack ignition on it, EDIS. And I says, oh, look at here, this guy put his own spark plugs in, and I saw little black lines on it. I said, they cracked, it looked like. I didn't look at them all that close. I said, put him another set of plugs in there. He come back the next day, skipping the same way, had the same kind of marks on it. And it turned out that it had carbon tracks inside the spark plug wire. Now these, the first and only time I ever saw that, well, there may be somebody else that's seen it, but when I saw it, it was always on Qualpack ignition. I never saw it on a vehicle with distributor ignition. I never even saw it on one that had HEI distributor ignition. But when that spark plug gets too much resistance and that spark's looking for somewhere to go, this is just a very gentle example of it, but it will jump all the way down the plug from there all the way to the shell of the plug. And it can do it in several places and all that, but that's one I took a picture of. It's hard to get a good picture of the inside of that wire where that carbon track was. You remember the carbon tracks in the distributor caps, and how the black distributor caps were so horrible to carbon track, and then Chrysler went to the brown ones, and Ford went to the gray ones, but whenever you had those black ones, and the brown distributor caps Chrysler used wasn't as bad to carbon track, and the gray ones Ford used weren't. The Ford ones, though, that gray material had a tendency, that ozone would react with that gray material the cap was made out of, and it makes some gummy clear stuff in there that looked kind of like water, but it was sort of syrupy stuff, and it would cause crossfiring inside the cap, even without carbon tracks, just like if you had moisture in there. When you pull it off and looked at it, it looked like moisture, but that ain't what it was. So what Ford did is they put a vent on the distributor cap to let the ozone out so you didn't have that problem. Fairly easy to do. This right here, I was at a class on transmissions, and this guy brought this piston with him. And notice there's several things you can pick out here. This one here, they took it apart and put it back together 2 or 3 times because they had one gear that wouldn't engage. Look at that crack. Alright, that was really hard for them to spot. But if you look at this really close, this is the new part, that's the old part. See the wear right there? And how straight this is compared to that? You know, that kind of stuff makes the transmission mechanic. If you got a transmission mechanic that's not looking really close at every little part, it's really easy to miss stuff like that, and it's the ones that have a problem like this that will just beat you up something awful. And that was a really interesting little, this was an aluminum piston, by the way. This right here was a tire pull situation. These tires right here was on the car. You could stand them next to each other, and you could tell, now they weren't exactly lined up, but that tire was a little taller than that one, and that made the car pull. And I used to tell my students, you know, I says, whenever you've got one that's pulling and you've checked the alignment angles and everything looks right and the tire pressures are the same, you know, the tires may look good. They may look like there's nothing wrong with them. You drive it down the road, it's pulling to the right. The first thing I want you to do is swap the tires from the left and the front from the left to the right. And it's amazing how many times you could swap some decent looking tires from the left to the right and it would pull in the other direction. That way you know it's a tire and you don't need to worry about fooling with anything else before you replace the tires. A lot of people don't want to hear that because they say, well, the tires still look good. Well, that's what you're pulling. Now, you can move them to the back of the car and that will reduce the pull. Sometimes it does away with it completely, but anyway, that's just one of the things. I ran into this at the tire store the other day. The guy was pointing that out, you know, and said they had a tire pull because of this tire right here being, you know, a slightly different height than that one. And the customer was confused by it. You might notice the thread looks really good on both those tires too. 215/65 R16s. This was my dad standing next to a Renault. He actually had that foreign car garage where he worked on those 28 different kinds of foreign cars, and Renault's was one of the ones he worked on. Renault, if you want to say it that way, but he called it a Renault because that's what it looked like phonetically. One of the things I've noticed about people that don't spell good is they seem to understand phonics really well because they'll phonetically spell a word so that it looks totally crazy. Anyway, the point is, here he was, and this was like in the early 60s. And he told me, he says, whenever you get one of these Renaults and you get in it, you go driving it around, if it was nearly a new car, you'd think, man, this is perfect. This is just what I need. And he said, about a year later, it was falling apart. Well, whenever we got the Renault franchise back in the 80s, whenever I was working over there at that big dealer in Dothan. And Jeep actually came with the Renault franchise at the time, and that's one of the reasons we bought it, because we wanted the Jeep franchise. But, you know, you get one, you get the other. And the crazy thing about the way some of these Renault medallions were set up was the wires that were wired from one end of the car to the other for whatever purpose were not color coded, other than the fact that they were all the same color wire on a lot of those cars. And the only way they would differentiate was they would have a little bit of paint painted on the wire right there by the connector. And if you follow that to the other end of that harness, whether it was on the other side of the engine compartment or the back of the car, that same color paint would be smeared on that red wire, but the paint was so fragile you could scratch it off of there with your fingernails. This was the most ridiculous thing I ever saw. That wiring stuff was totally wacky on those medallions. And of course, when we were doing pre-deliveries on those, there was a little relay we were supposed to pull out of the fuse panel and replace it with a little jumper. I guess it had something to do with an ignition off draw situation or something like that. But I was thinking, oh, I've never seen anybody do something crazy like this. Well, you might remember a few weeks back I told you that I had bought my wife a 93 Tempo that was brand new. I had a beautiful picture of it somewhere. Anyway, that Tempo, I was going to put remote keyless entry on that Tempo for her. And I had put remote keyless entry on a lot of vehicles at the dealer, so I was really good at it. I could do it in less than an hour, you know, because I knew exactly what to do and how to do it and all that. And I knew the wire colors. You know, the wire colors coming off of that were pink and blue and all that kind of pink and green and so on and so forth. And I knew exactly which color went where, what you had to do. But when I pulled the door panel off my wife's brand new Tempo, every wire coming off of that, it was a 93 Tempo, every wire coming off of that power door lock switch was red. And I thought, this is the stupidest fool thing I've ever seen in my life. Boy, don't you know. And the instructions that they put with those keyless entry kits don't even factor in that some of those, you know, I never saw another one even at the dealer, as many ones as I worked on, that had all red wires. They must have just ran out of the right color wires at the dealer and just wired it up with red wires or something. That's the most wacky thing I've ever seen. I say, this reminds me of a Renault. Except there wasn't any paint smeared on the wire. It was just all red wires, but I figured it out and got it on there and got it working. This was Justice Brothers. I used to use Justice Brothers stuff. Now, when I worked at that gas station a few years before this, some of the additives, I don't remember what the additive was that you were supposed to pour in there with oil. It was sort of a reddish colored additive that was supposed to make the oil last longer and be better and all that kind of stuff. And you had to open it with a can opener. It didn't have a pop top or anything like that. But whenever one of the filling station mechanics would sell a can of that stuff to the customer, they'd pour it in there, and there was money in the can. You could cut the can open and it'd have quarters or it'd have nickels. It would have anywhere from 35 to 50 cents in there or something like that in every single can. Well, Justice Brothers, whenever I was wearing this hat, this was on a trip I made to Arizona, and my mother took a picture of me whenever, because she and I went out there together. But anyway, when I was wearing that, I was working at that, doing that fleet maintenance down there in Texas. And I see how much different I look now than the way I looked back then. But I should put on some sunglasses and a hat so you can really tell. Anyway, Justice Brothers had these little washer-shaped plastic plugs in there with a hole in the middle. And you save those, and whenever the JB man came by, every one of those you had, he'd give you a quarter for it. So if you had, you know, a lot of those, you get a lot of quarters. We bought lunch with that money whenever it come around. We, you know, pouring that, you know, using that stuff and pouring in for oil additives and all that kind of. Justice Brothers, incidentally, is still around. You can look them up. They still make automotive chemicals. It's a pretty cool outfit, really. And I don't even know what happened to that hat, but I was wearing it back in 1978. That is all I got for you today, and I really, really appreciate you guys tuning in and listening to me ramble. And I will talk to you all next Monday.